Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Location, Location, Location. Does it matter for Southern corn rust management? I'm Chris Boomsma and Director of Education here at the American Society of Agronomy. Welcome to today's webinar and another webinar in the lawn series that we have with the Crop Protection Network. So with that, let's get started for today. First of all, I do want to obviously thank the Crop Protection Network. Their support of this webinar series brings this great content to you all around pest management, and it's coming to you free of charge. So generous support by Crop Protection Network. Please check out their website for more information. It's obviously a product of multiple land-grant universities, so a lot of great information coming to you. Now, some housekeeping items before we get started today. These are the same ones you've seen before, but they're worth reviewing. First of all, please contact Lacey Edwardson, my colleague, if you have any issues that you need addressed. Maybe it's something with registration, CEUs, something with GoToWebinar. Please reach out to Lacey first. She is waiting, standing by, ready and able to help you with your customer service needs. So again, it is 608-268-4953 if you cannot see the slide I'm showing. Again, 608-268-4953. This webinar is worth one CEU in pest management or professional meetings, and that depends on your certification. And you will be getting those automatically for attending today. Next, type your questions in the questions box. Please submit them to me at any time. You do not have to wait to the very end. Just submit those questions. I'll take them, order them, post them to our presenters, and we'll be off with the off to the Q&A period at the very end. So again, submit them at any time. We should hopefully have about 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions today. Please note that this training session is being recorded. You will have access to both the recording and to the slides at a later date. We try to get them to you within 1 week, but often quicker than that. So be on the lookout for those. Be on the lookout for future webinars offered by the American Society of Agronomy. We're wrapping up here now for this month. Well, we're going to start in January, February, March, all going to be months where you get a lot of content coming your way. So please join us, including for more content on this series. I'm not going to go through all the webinars in this series. Please look at the web link you see on your screen at this time, or just do a web search for Crop Protection Network, American Society of Agronomy. You'll probably get the right page just doing that search. Join us, please. It's a great series, a lot of good content. Okay, now to introduce today's speakers, and they're going to be coming on now as I introduce them. So our first speaker who's going to be with us today is Travis Faske, who is a professor and extension plant pathologist at the University of Arkansas. In this role, he addresses challenges in disease management through research and extension work. He enjoys helping farmers and consultants navigate those challenges by developing management plans and identifying new strategies. Prior to his work with extension, he was an instructor at Tarleton State University, a small ag college in Texas. He has a bachelor's in plant soil science from Tarleton State, master's in plant path from Oklahoma State, and a PhD in plant pathology from Texas A&M. Serves on multiple boards, including that of the Society of Nematology and the Crop Protection Network, so the group we're talking about today, and who's generously supporting this event. Next speaker is going to be Robert Kemerait, who is a professor and extension specialist at the University of Georgia. In this role, he has extension responsibilities for disease and nematode management in corn, cotton, peanut, and soybean in Georgia. Robert works at developing management programs for growers that include the use of resistant varieties and fungicides and nematicides. He participates in projects in other countries such as Cambodia, the Philippines, and Haiti. He's a bachelor's in biology from Davidson College, a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and a PhD in plant pathology from the University of Florida. So welcome, Robert. And our last speaker, Allison Robertson, who is a professor and extension field pathologist at Iowa State University. In this role, she evaluates seed and foliar applied fungicides on corn for efficacy against economically important diseases in Iowa. These trials are done at various research farms around the state, and the efficacy data is shared with Iowa farmers. She has a bachelor's in plant pathology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, a master's in philosophy and plant path from the University of Zimbabwe, and a PhD in plant pathology from Clemson University. Prior to studying for her doctorate, she was an extension pathologist in Zimbabwe for 5 years and also worked at the Tobacco Research Board. Welcome, Allison. So with that, I'm going to ask our 3 speakers to come on today. And Travis, I know you're going to be running the slides for today. So the presenter privileges, sir, are coming your way. And when you are ready, we really look forward to seeing your slides and listening to each of you present today. Welcome. Excellent, Travis. We can see your slides perfectly at this time. Oh, unfortunately, we're having just a slight issue with your audio, sir. If I think maybe you come off mute, we'll be good.
That's exactly it. Too many buttons.
No problem.
All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and get started. The location idea is something I thought of for our presentation today. It's something you often hear from realtors, right? But is this true for actually corn diseases? So today we have 3 panelists who are all passionate about corn diseases and southern corn rust. And we're all from different regions, from the north central, the southeast, and the south central region. And we're all going to chime in at different times on our different perspective of southern corn rust management. Allison will talk a little bit about some of the fungicide timing, and Bob will too, from more of the management. But I'm going to go ahead and get started with some of the introduction to southern rust. Right. Okay. So if I walk out into the field sometime around mid-July and I see rust, it's usually going to be southern rust. And this is often what I see the first time. I see these little orange pustules here that it's indicative of southern rust. And here I've actually got the silks here. It's about the time that I'll normally start looking for it. You can start seeing it. And this is commonly what happens. You'll have one spot here, and then about 7 to 14 days later, you'll get this explosion of southern rust, and it'll build over time and increase exponentially. Some of the symptoms you see, this is the lower side of the leaf, and on that bottom side, right where the pustules are located, the leaf tissue is discolored, lighter green in this case, and that can vary from hybrid to hybrid. Look closely at those pustules. You can actually see the epidermis here is kind of pulled back. A lot of spores. These are the Uridinea spores, and they're a little different. These are a little darker, but just because of the lighting from the camera. But you can see a lot of spores in each one of those pustules, and this produces the inoculum that is going to infect the corn in this field, and multiple cycles can happen in a growing season. Move on past that early stage. Here we are at a kind of a R5 stage, and now we have a lot of southern rust. So the leaves are probably the most susceptible portion of the plant. Here you can see it's really grainy, and that happens for us in the Mid-South when we get very humid conditions and no wind. And so you'll see this. If it get a really windy day, it won't be this obvious, or you get a heavy rain shower, it'll wash all those spores off. So this has been out there for a few days. Here we see the southern rust on the leaf sheath. And so especially at the end of the season, it can be pretty severe on the sheath and very showy here. And then here on the husk as well. Not as much. I know others have probably seen more. This is common for me later in the season. This is usually the last thing that's kind of still green. And so you do see a little bit of rust pustules there. These are some of my glamour shots when it comes to southern corn rust. Here you see it mostly in the upper canopy on the image on the left. This is pretty consistent for southern rust in our area. I usually tell consultants when they're looking for it, kind of look about chest and upper canopy for southern rust. But when you get high humidity and the humidity just only stays in the lower canopy, that environment is the driving force for this disease, and that humidity is needed for it to develop. And so we see it here in the lower canopy, but the caveat I have to tell you is this field was sprayed. And so you can see that the coverage is just going to be in the upper canopy, often doesn't get down really low. In this case, this was kind of a poor application. All right, the pathogen is Puccinia polysora, and it was first described on eastern gamagrass, which we have a lot in the state, but I don't see much southern rust on eastern gamagrass. And so I don't know if that was a different physiological race, and we have different races now, but there are 11 physiological races that are described. But I think that culture was kind of lost, which is unfortunate. but there are some different races out there. A host range for everyone here today is corn. That's the most important one, but then there are a few grasses, including eastern gamma grass. The spores, there's two spore types. These are the Uridinea spores. So this is a zoom in of one of those pustules, and you can actually see there's a little bit of ornamentation around the Uridinea spore, and that allows it to move and be carried by the wind currents. Later in the season, you can see teleospores, but there's no known alternate host for this particular pathogen, so we really don't know what their function is. So here's just a really simplified life cycle. Here, let's start with the telea and the teleospores that I showed you. These are the darker pustules here, kind of later in the season. After harvest, there's really no rust left, and it has to actually be reintroduced each year, especially for us in Arkansas, and usually from, it seems like from Mexico or the Caribbean is usually the one that is focused on where this is originating or reoccurring from. Typically, the reproductive growth stage is where the plant is most susceptible. So again, that's where we see most of our southern rust. I don't see so much of it at a vegetative stage, but we do see it more or less after the reproduction. And then you get plant to plant transfer and exchange in the field, and movement, it seems, northward following the wind currents from those of us in the southern states to the northeast. And the environment we really need is here's just kind of an oversimplified version, is some type of free moisture and warm temperatures, kind of hence the name for southern rust. I have here 80 degrees. What I usually tell consultants is if you're walking out in the morning, it's 75 degrees. Yes, that happens here in Arkansas. And you get a rain shower. And you get a rain shower at 10, and that happens a couple of days in a row. Those are the type of conditions where southern rust really takes off. Now, we can get 100 degrees, no free moisture, no humidity, and the southern rust doesn't move that aggressively in the field or moving from one field to another. All right, hybrids, there is some variation in susceptibility among hybrids. But hybrids don't last very long. And in this case, this hybrid, the Pioneer, is not commonly grown in our area, but you can see it's very susceptible compared to this decab. But this decab is not immune. They are susceptible, and most of the hybrids, and I think my colleagues on this webinar would agree that most of them are susceptible. And we usually treat most of them as susceptible. I usually don't do a whole lot of ratings. All right, when we're out scouting, this is just kind of an important part because we need to determine when this is coming in. Again, I'll look at the most mature corn. This scout is out here. A lot of them recognize when the silks start to turn a little color, getting into an R3 stage is a perfect time to go out and look. If I'm going to go scout an area, I'll usually go looking at the oldest corn. Even if it's R5 is usually the best one where I can find it the first time. Usually I'll look along the edge of the field. I can certainly look at more corn at that time instead of walking in the middle of the field, but I know there's some diehard consultants that spend their time in the middle of corn and they can find it. I'm not always that lucky. What I usually try to do though is look for an area that has been shaded, maybe where the sunlight doesn't burn off the dew as quickly. Those are the areas where I often find southern rust. And again, kind of looking in that mid to upper canopy is where I often find it, and somewhere about where this fellow is looking. All right, some of the doppelgangers that are out there. The one that tricks up most people, especially for me in Arkansas, is common rust. Now this picture does a wonderful job of giving you a comparison between the two rust pathogens that infect corn. But Puccinia sorghii is, in our area, most commonly found in the lower canopy, and it tends to prefer cooler conditions. So by the time it runs around July, common rust starts to shut down, southern rust starts to pick up. But you get a nice contrast here of the orange from southern rust, the brick red color from common rust. And if you flip the leaf over with common rust, the pustule does rupture through the lower canopy, and you can actually see spores there where we don't see that for southern rust. Curvularia leaf spot is another one that I often have to take a double take in the field when I'm rating, because in the upper canopy I often see it. And if you look at southern rust from the underside of the leaf, it really looks like this curvularia leaf spot. So it's worth a second look. And something that's probably more in Allison's area than really mine is the Physoderma brown spot. It's really a rare find here. I had to really take some nice pictures with it for the first time that I found it a couple of years ago. But these are the three common ones. There are some others out there. So just be aware. Usually the first time of the year, I like to confirm that it is southern rust under a microscope. And all of us, the three of us on this panel.
Make one question for you, Travis,
Yeah,
and that is if there's consultants from the Southeast, and I don't know how many there would be, but up until 2021, if we saw black pustules or dark pustules, Travis, they would have been the teleospores, as you mentioned, and would have been a form of southern rust. But we've found for the first time tar spot, and there's been a lot of confusion going out there. Are we seeing tar spot? Are we seeing teleospores? So consultants are going to have to be, and even myself, with the new disease, which can be confusing. So in addition to what you showed, a couple lookalikes could be, is it tar spot or is it teleospores, and what difference would that make? Probably only in our later planted corn. So
good point. Yeah, there's a microscope as a pathologist's best friend, right? Making sure that you have the right pathogen, and then how you're treating it is certainly going to be important. This is a map of where southern rust was detected and confirmed, not only in the South, but certainly in the Midwest across the Corn Belt. So not just exclusive to the South, but you can see here it's widely distributed by the end of the season. I think initially it started out in either Texas or Georgia, and then really kind of moves through the Mississippi River Valley. For me, I know that I look for Louisiana and Mississippi. If it shows up there, I know I've got a couple of weeks and it'll be in Arkansas. And the timing that I tell consultants to start looking for it is July 1st. Bob, what's your experience? Where do you tell them when it's going to start coming in? And is there a county, a state, another one that you look at that where it may show up first?
yeah, Travis, we have sentinel plots we put out. Our growers put out. This is the most important foliar disease they face, and they don't take it lightly. We tend to see it coming in the southwest corner of the state, the junction between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And when we're going to have a problem with rust, it usually is going to be in our sentinel plots in that part of the state by the second week of June, the first or second week of June. Sometimes we can see it towards the end of May, but we know if it's in the state of Georgia anywhere by the second week of June, it's probably going to be a year where losses will occur if we don't protect. If we don't see rust until July, which happens on some years, then it's probably not going to be a major problem except for late planted corn. So timing, early June, late May spells trouble for our growers. It always starts in the southwest corner of the state.
Yeah, I think I've the latest I've ever seen it was August, and that was benign year for southern rust. Allison, what about you? When do you typically see it, or is there a state that you watch? Maybe you watch Arkansas.
I do watch Arkansas and Kansas, so and see where the disease is developing. And I mean, typically, I would say that we usually start to get reports of it kind of mid to the end of July, and a lot of times I find that it doesn't do a whole lot after that. So we just have small patches in the field. And I mean, the other point about coming in mid-July, late August is we're well into grain fill by then. So we're probably at, R3, R4, depending on the planting date of the corn. So we're coming, it's coming in late grain fill. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good point. I know this past year we had some rainfall that really delayed our planting. And so those guys who plant late, are certainly at a higher risk when it comes to southern rust. I know that's the timing I usually worry about it the most.
Yeah, I had some corn that was planted May the 31st this year down in southeast Iowa, and it's the first year where I went into the field and saw southern rust throughout one of my trials, and I came out covered in orange spores, just like the pictures that you guys post, and I was like, yes, I've finally been baptized with southern rust.
The orange badge of courage. Yep. Yeah. Excellent. All right, moving on, just a couple more slides from my end. This is a summary of a publication of corn yield loss estimates, and I've just pulled out southern rust, and this gives you an idea of how many thousands of bushels are estimated to be lost. So I kind of overemphasize the estimate part here because we kind of look at our sentinel plots or our fungicide trials and kind of try to extrapolate how much loss that would be. But if you're in the Midwest here and you think, well, they're talking about southern rust and it's not a problem, obviously from the yield loss here, it certainly is an issue. And the other thing is kind of relates back to the monitoring part of it is some years it's really bad and some years it's not. Now this is just yield loss, and of course that's probably extremely high for the northern part because of the acres. The next slide I have, this is percentage of the total acres. And so to me, this is kind of better representation of where it's most consistently severe. You can see by the percentage there, it's not extremely high, but that's because there's a lot of fungicides going out to actually protect some of this corn. But you can see in what I think it's 5 out of these 8 years that the South typically has more severe issues with southern rust than the northern part of the state. But Allison, I would say that for us in Arkansas, northern cornleaf blight, so we don't have tar spot yet, but this is our main issue. This is what every consultant focuses on. Is that the same for your area? What's your feel for it?
No, I mean, like for us, particularly in Iowa, right? So remember, a lot of the corn in Iowa is not irrigated. So we're just relying on natural rainfall events, natural moisture there in the air. So relative, high relative humidities. And so, I mean, the diseases that we've been traditionally most concerned with have been gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight. If I think of my neighbors, to the west, Nebraska, and then to the east, Indiana, kind of way, they have more irrigated corn, right? And so southern rust can be more of a concern for them when it comes in early enough during grainfall because of that irrigation. But I mean, in Iowa, I've been at Iowa State since 2004. And I've, apart from the southwest corner of Iowa, kind of those counties along the border with Kansas and Nebraska, one of my agronomists out there have told me that they can get very severe southern rust there and probably some yield loss. But, for the most part, I don't worry about southern rust. So, and we're definitely not spraying fungicides for southern rust here in Iowa. Our fungicide applications are going out for gray leaf spot, for northern corn leaf blight, and also for better standability towards the end of the growing season, which is arguably not very, I concerns me a little bit, but yeah.
Sure, but that's interesting. That's kind of part of the webinar is just like location. So you do see those differences. And like you mentioned, your dry land, well, we're mostly irrigated. So we're kind of compounding the problem sometimes. And I often see even in my furrow irrigated fields, sometimes that humidity, if it stays wet for a long time and you get a rain shower that keeps it flooded longer than you'd like, sometimes that can exasperate something like southern corn rust. And Bob, what about you and your growers in Georgia or the Southeast with southern rust?
Yeah, what I think is interesting here, Travis, is 2014 and 2019. Because if I was to pick, since my time here, the two worst years, the two threats for us in the South and Georgia would have been those years. And what's interesting is, or they were certainly important years, but it wasn't so in the Midwest as far as the black bars. And I think that this shows two things. The first thing is a location. The second thing is differences perhaps in where in the South the rust is occurring in the severe. Because what happens in Georgia may be less translatable to what happens in Iowa, whereas what happened to Tom Allen in Mississippi or with Trey Price in Louisiana, that may be more of the pathway that comes. But I would say if you look at these years where you have the significant red bars, every years except for 18 or 13 and 18, these are years that our growers, the message to our growers is you get to tassel, you're under irrigation, you have your finger on the trigger, and whether you pull the trigger or not is based upon our sentinel plots and everything else. But every corn grower in the state has got their finger on that trigger if they want to, if they're ready to make the top yields that they're potentially making. Whether they pull or not, that may be based upon other factors like sentinel plots. But every grower in the state is prepared to do something or wants to do something if it's capable. Our biggest limitation at tassel is not do we want to spray, it's how do we put the application out.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting and good point. And I would point out for us, like you said, it's location where even there is some variation within the South, because 2016 I would have not had as my banner year for southern rust, but I would agree with 2018. It was kind of disappointing in some of our field trials for those of us who are pathologists who love to see disease. Well, great discussion so far. Bob, I'm gonna hand it over to you and let you talk a little bit about some of your fungicide efficacy and timing work, and then I'll just kind of advance the slides on my end as needed.
All right, well, great, Travis. I appreciate that. And I just want to start out by saying thanks to you all for including us in this. And I think the discussion revolves around, it's not just how important it is in the South, it's Allison, how important it is in Iowa as well. It's a fascinating disease. It's a disease that matters, but it doesn't matter to everybody, and it doesn't matter to everybody all the time. And I think that's what we want to get out of this presentation. As a little bit of a history lesson, prior to 2003, the University of Georgia and our Georgia Extension had no recommendations for treating for rust. We didn't believe the value of the corn, or the value of the rust to the corn versus the cost of fungicides made it worth spraying. And it came from a grower. A grower said, well, show me the data. If you don't think I should spray, show me the data. There wasn't one. There wasn't data. And in 2003, we started doing fungicide trials. And what we quickly learned is it was wrong to not have recommendations, because that first year with the grower who was told you don't need to spray, well, a single fungicide application made him 25 bushels of corn. And he just looked at me after that. He still speaks to me, but it's a different relationship, I assure you. So if I can get the next slide, please. The two biggest considerations our growers have, there's three biggest considerations. The first consideration is, when do we start spraying? And when do we start spraying is based upon the growth stage of the crop and the sentinel plots that we have spread across the state. The tassel application is primarily when we recommend growers to be prepared, or as they approach tassel. I wouldn't say tassel, as you approach tassel. We can spray earlier when we talk about northern corn leaf blight or southern corn leaf blight. Those diseases we typically, if we need to treat for them, which it isn't very often, we're going to want to be in the field earlier than that. There's also some growers who simply don't have access to high boys and simply don't have access to airplanes, aerial applications. A lot of our corn at V-Tassel and beyond is sprayed with airplanes. So they're going to want to try and go out earlier if they possibly can, simply because they can get through the field. So it's, when do you initiate? And then how often do you spray? When do you start? Tassels are where we put the trigger, but do you need to spray more than that? And then the last question is, does it matter what we spray? Because the cost difference between something like tebuconazole and some of our premium fungicides is not only efficacy, but there's certainly cost out there. So I'd like to start with this chart. This is from probably the most impressive year we've had for corn rust in Georgia, though we've had it many times since then. And this uniform corn study, this was in conjunction with my colleagues like Travis, like Allison around the country, putting out the same kind of fungicides. We had fungicides that went out at the V8 application, and on the far left, you could see the untreated in red. We had V8 applications, we had VT at tassel applications, and then we had V8 plus tassel application. And if you look at this, you could see the disease severity really for the southern rust, that was the primary disease we had. There was no real difference. There was no significant difference between untreated and putting a fungicide application out at the V8 growth stage. Why? Because the rust didn't come in until later than that. If you look, the tassel application, VT, then you can start to see the significant differences. That red bar in the middle of it, anything below that red bar is significantly lower in disease than our untreated was. And so you can see a headline amp there, a single application of headline amp at 46.3%, much lower than the 62.5% of the untreated. You can go across, and then you can see where we had the V8 and the VT applications together. And really, there wasn't that much difference. The fungicides, some of the fungicides that were not statistically different from the untreated at the VT alone were significantly different when you had the two applications. So you do get some benefit, but not a whole lot of benefit. What I would like to point out as well is if you look at that headline amp, the headline amp at the VT application 46.3, you can look at the Fortix over there. We typically do have some fungicides like headline amp, like Veltima, like Trivapro when it comes to these applications that do have better control, but they're all controlling in some way. The one fungicide that until recently growers really wanted to spray was Tilt, the propiconazole. And the reason for that is very inexpensive and readily accessible. And it just, in our situation, propiconazole has not been a strong rust fungicide. Tebuconazole has been better, but they don't have the same power that some of these other fungicides do. Travis, if I could have the next slide, please.
Yeah, I sure will. I just like to concur with you, especially with the tilt here. I see the same thing in our area. So there are certainly some similarities we have when it comes to efficacy.
And I'll make a comment that I also agree with that. I mean, I know on seed corn up here that it's fungicides that include a strobilurin or a QOI that are doing much better against the rusts than just those DMIs alone. You need that QOI component in those fungicides for rust.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. And now we're putting SDHIs in them as well. Basically, what I think you buy with putting something else with the triazole, you increase the protective window. If we're putting just triazole out by itself, we say we're looking at about 2 weeks of protection. Put the mixed fungicides in, we're looking at probably 3 weeks. If you look here at the far left with the untreated, 150 bushels per acre, and you can see that the single application, even though we didn't see much disease difference, you could see that there was numeric increase in yield, not statistically different, but the single application did produce some yield increases, probably delayed the onset of or slowed the epidemic a little bit and did result in some yield increase. But where we saw the best yield increase and not much difference between the VT and the VT plus the V8 was a single application at the tassel growth stage. And there you could see with that headline amp, and again, I'm not here to advertise for any one fungicide, but headline amp is one that we've been successful with. You can see that the difference between 150 and 219, almost 70 bushels an acre going out there. So it was a tremendous yield increase. If you look across the board, almost everything that was sprayed at tassel time or at tassel plus V8 has given us significant yield increase. And we're talking 40, 50, 60 bushels an acre. That's what's at risk if we don't. Now, what's missing from this, and I wish I could go back, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, is what would have happened if we had had a tassel plus 2 weeks later, okay? So if we'll go to the next slide, Travis, and this is from 2020, okay? And what you can see is the check, the untreated, the orange bar on the far left, and that red bar statistical differences. Okay, this was one. We didn't have multiple applications here. We just went out with a tassel application, same growth stage. And you can see really a single application in 2020, which was a tough year for corn rust or for southern rust. It was only things like Trivapro in purple and the headline amp and aqua that actually gave us a significant yield decrease. This is towards the end of the season. The Top Guard EQ did, the Lucento did. A lot of them gave us a lower disease rating. Statistically, it was fewer. Miravis Neo, Lucento headline amp. Again, I'm not here to advertise, but just to show the biggest problem. If we go to the next slide, Travis, if I would do this trial over again, I think the mistake I made here was not anticipating how important that second application 2 weeks later would have been. And so in a situation like 2020, that single fungicide application, you can see with the Miravis Neo and with the Trivapro and with the Fortix and perhaps with the Lucento, we did make 15 bushels an acre or 10 to 12 to 15 bushels an acre increase. But I think the problem in not making more is the intensity of the rust, and we really needed to hit it once at tassel and come back a second time 2 to 3 weeks later. Unfortunately, we didn't do that, and that took some of the yield away from us.
Yeah, Bob, that's really interesting. I like your slide here. Now, is this a normal planting time for in Georgia as far as this trial goes?
Yeah, I should have put the planting date on here. This would have been planted in later in April, so it's not the earliest one. Okay. Certainly well within the window of when our growers would do it. If they had planted at the end of March or the 1st of April, they may have been able to escape some of this damage. Planting in later April, which is getting the middle of the planting window or maybe a little bit later, you really put yourself up against some of this disease pressure that you might not otherwise would have.
Yeah, sure. You know, you can look at all these trials and you can find small differences. I don't see as good of a response as you have from the headline amp or the Stratego YLD, but for me, the Quilt XL still does fantastic in my area. So it's something that we often recommend. Now you have all these brand name products, and you know, we're here in 2021, going into 2022. I hear some talking about maybe limitations with fungicide availability. How do you see these generics that are out there? What's your thought about them? We've looked at a few of them. Most time they look pretty close to some of the trade products, but I've only looked at them a couple of years. What's been your experience?
Well, there's a couple things to say about that. I'm glad you brought that up, Travis. The first thing is, where we hear there's going to be tight fungicides available in 2022, we hear a lot of that too, but we also hear down here there's going to be some of the generics that are going to be the tightest. You know, generic tebuconazole, generic azoxystrobin, generic pyraclostrobin. So that may be an issue in itself. I think generics will work very well as long as we do, Allison, as you mentioned, and that's to have a combination of product. So a generic tebuconazole, a generic pyraclostrobin, a generic azoxystrobin, we're going to run into the same problems we do. It doesn't matter what the name brand is on them. We need to have products that have mixed modes of action to give us longer protective window and also to give greater efficacy.
So, you know, as we're talking about this, I had one other thought, and this is a question I get from consultants. You know, southern rust is coming in at different timings. You know, Allison kind of mentioned, well, I'm not treating for it because it's coming in so late. But for you and I in the South, you know, what do you tell consultants when they ask, when am I done? When am I out of the woods? When can I stop scouting my corn and I'm finished? And after you say yours, I'm gonna tell you what I usually tell them in my area.
All right. And that's a great question because we get that all the time.
Yeah.
And we say, and it's based upon, it's more experiential than it is, you know, if Pierre Bruder, the grower from 2003, asked me for the data, I'd have to say, well, you're going to have to trust me a little on this one, which didn't go far in that first time. But we tell growers, once you get into hard dough, once you get into the dense stage, R6 growth stage, that area, we think that there's not enough time and not enough damage will occur. Some consultants here like to go all the way to the black layer. For us, I think there's nothing wrong with that other than it's going to be more costly for you. So hard dough stage, dense stage, I think that for us, that's about the time we say it's your whatever happens. What I tell them is either you've controlled it well enough now that you're out of the woods, or you didn't control it and it doesn't matter what you do now. So it's a good point for us.
Right, and that kind of goes back to your point about that early timing. Then you're having to do something twice. That's going to be more expensive, and are you going to get a return on your investment? We kind of run about the same timeline here. Usually I say from VT to R3, if it comes in, I'd probably go ahead and treat. That dough stage is really kind of, for me, still kind of a gray area. It really depends on the environment. You know, if we get a dry year, probably like, yeah, don't worry about it, let it go. Last year was one of those times where I talked to consultants and it was, yeah, we're getting rain showers in the south of the state. The northern part of the state, we're not getting that. So it is a kind of a field by field call. And you know, this past year we talked about actually spraying, but I agree with you that the R5, after that, I'm done. And you know, Allison, I'd like to bring you in here on this part, just kind of curiosity. When it comes to the stalk integrity, you guys are spraying, you said, kind of for the standability. Is that, I mean, what's your timing on that? Is it that VT, or is it, you know, anything past that it's not worth doing?
Yeah, no. So we've done a little bit of work on the effect of fungicides on standability, and I mean, we do see that they help with that VTR1 application, and I have not gone later than that. I've done some early work on kind of the V5 application. I didn't think that that helped with standability, but that VTR1 that helps with standability, and I don't, you know, I mean, I suspect that an R3 would be, you know, would also help with standability, but not necessarily be any better than that VT. And in actual fact, it just might take longer, excuse me, for that corn to dry down if you're going in, you know, R3, R4. So yeah, that would be my thoughts. I do have a question. Wait, before Bob moves on. So Bob, I wanted to ask you, you talk about the fungicides having, you know, you're seeing those fungicides last 2 to 3 weeks down in Georgia. Sometimes you might go in and that R1, R3 application, double application, just to get that longer effective period. And we hear a lot of talk about the newer products, the Valtimer, the Miravis Neo, you know, Trivapro and the BASF having longer effective periods, so lasting for, you know, 5-6 weeks. And I know that I have definitely seen that in one of my trials with gray leaf spot. And so yeah, I'm just wondering, do you see a longer effective period down there in the south? Or
That's a great question, because we hear the slogan, not necessarily from any one company, but one and done. And
yes.
I absolutely do not buy into that. You can say from one and done from a single application. You may be, but it depends upon what Travis said. It depends upon the environment. It depends upon the pressure. I don't think any fungicide can, I can't say that any single fungicide sprayed at tassel is going to be all a grower needs to the end of the season to maximize profit. Some are better than others, but I don't think that any, we can say without any hesitation, can last that range.
Okay.
I'll make this quick, Travis. I know we're running out of time, but the main take-home point here is that in Georgia, certainly if you're not watching sentinel plots, if you're not watching growth stage, we can spray for southern rust. It can be too early. The second thing is Allison, based upon what we're talking now, a VTassel application, VT application is our standard without any other information. That's what we're looking at, but it may not be enough, and it may not matter what product you spray. Depending upon the pressure in the environment, a single application of tassel may not make the most profit for our corn growers in the South.
All right, thanks, Bob. So I'm going to turn it over to Allison. She's going to give us a little bit of update on some of her research on, you know, does the amount of disease matter?
So this is probably a little bit of a complicated picture to look at, but it's yield responses to a fungicide application at R1. And I have a couple of years, 2019 and 2018, where we saw high disease severity. So this would be greater than 5% gray leaf spot on the ear leaf at R5 or dent. And then in 2020 and 2021, we had very dry growing seasons. And so we had less than 1% disease on the ear leaf. And once again, this is for gray leaf spot. So, which would be probably our #1 disease that we're managing in Iowa. But I think that this slide pretty clearly shows that we get higher yield responses when we have more disease. And that makes sense, right? Because we're controlling the disease better, and therefore we're getting this, this yield response. And so, you know, as we think about spraying fungicides, we should be using them to manage these foliar disease and not for these plant health benefits. If you go to the next slide, Travis, that has the numbers. So each of these bars are representative of a different number of site years, right? So you can see that, you know, for Mirabis Neo, for example, in 2021, I had 6 locations, 2026 locations, 4 locations in 2019, and 3 locations in 2018. So I do have multiple site years. And this agrees with a lot of the studies that have been published on corn, on using fungicides on corn, is that we tend to see a better yield response when we have disease on that crop. And so, you know, and Bob's talked about, you know, how with southern rust, spray that corn and you're going to get 25 to 60 bushels, right? Depending on how severe the southern rust is. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of times our hybrids are pretty good at managing the disease, and then growing this dryland corn out here in Iowa, particularly the last few years, it's been very, very dry, kind of, you know, mid-June to mid-August. And so that really slows down disease progress in our part of the world. Next slide, Travis. So this is just a reminder that these fungicides that we are spraying are susceptible to fungicide resistance developing. And so we know that this is a problem with a lot of pathogens that affect soybean and wheat. And while we don't see a lot of resistance developing in corn fungus, in corn pathogens at the moment, we need to be mindful that resistance can still develop. And so there are monitoring efforts going on around the country to monitor this resistance. But as we've talked about with Bob, particularly, you know, choosing the right product to manage that disease. And so this is a publication that comes from the Crop Production Network, which gets updated every single year with my data, Travis's data, Bob's data, and all of our colleagues around the US. And it's a really neat publication because it not only shows you what the different mode of action groups that are available in each of these fungicide products, but then also what their efficacy is against that disease. So it's a useful publication. And then my last slide is just another plug for the Crop Protection Network, just thinking about fungicide resistance, and that the more that we're learning about fungicide resistance, the fungicides that we are using out in the field are not only used to control diseases on plants, but they're also used to control fungal diseases in humans and also animals. And so this is getting to the One Health concept that's going on around at the moment. And again, there's a publication on the Crop Protection Network if you're interested in that.
Excellent.
I think that's Travis, yeah.
All right, thanks, Allison. It's great information. And so we have a little time for questions. I'm going to kind of wrap up things. So location doesn't matter. I think we've seen by our panelists today that certainly from north to south things matter, change, especially from environment, but we also see environmental from east and west for Bob and I in the south. And certainly that's going to affect the onset of disease and then how we might manage it. But there's a lot of similarities, you know, especially from the fungicide timing and the efficacy and the benefits in the presence of disease are certainly similar, and we share that as far as management goes. Would like to thank our sponsors for this webinar, certainly supportive. Also, all the other partners that's involved with CPN. It's just 3 of us here, but on other CPN webinars, we'll include other experts from these various partners. And with that, I'm going to end. This is for time for questions, but we also have our email addresses here if you do find later on that you have a question for individuals on these panelists.
All right, Travis, great, thank you. It is time now for our question and answer period, folks. We do have some questions coming in. If you'd be so kind as to continue to submit questions, I'll try to get through all of them. And if we don't get through all of them, do indeed note that you have the contact information up there for Travis, Robert, and Allison. Okay, I'm just going to start at the top of the list here, Travis. We've got quite a diversity of questions. We really don't have to go in any particular theme direction. So here's the first one. This came in early. Maybe you answered this, but I'll ask it again. What is the current rust product of choice for early presentation of the disease?
So, you know, I think Bob did mention that a little bit. I think it's really most of these QOI materials with the DMI, even the QOI with an SDHI. There's so many of them. I really would refer back to that publication Allison talked about for, you know, the fungicide efficacy and with the information on the CPN. You know, that's probably the best route to go as far as individuals. Right now, most of us probably see Trivapro being one of the better products, but year in and year out, the yield protection by some of the others, even the Quilt Excel is good, and as well as other products. Bob or Allison, do you got anything else you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, from my perspective, that question is the question I get all the time, and my response is there is no single best. I can show what I would suggest that anyone who's interested is ask your local extension ask for some recent data and see. The main thing I tell growers is, if nothing else, look for those mixed mode of action products. And there are differences. I won't pretend there's not, but there are differences. But either an SDHI, and a triazole, an SDHI strobilurin, triazole, a triazole strobilurin, those products are more alike than they are different. Are there differences? Yes, but compared to not treating at all or a single mode of action, they are more alike than they are different. And to really refine it, seek information from your local extension and see what their recent trials may say.
I concur.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Allison. Thanks, Bob, also for the responses. Okay, moving on to the next one. Question, more of a big picture question for each of you, really. Do you have any opinion on the effects of climate change on southern corn rust?
Yeah, I think it goes back to environment, you know, the disease triangle. So anything that's going to affect it, like this past year, more rain, later planting, certainly could impact it for our area. And I'm gonna stop with that and just let some others comment.
I absolutely believe there's the potential there. This disease is so dependent upon reintroduction, and so we've seen a greater intensity of storms and greater frequency of storms coming out of the Gulf of Mexico recently. And I think that's one of the big drivers. We can oftentimes see early tropical storms coming into Georgia, the area bringing them. Also, this disease is more severe when we have warmer temperatures. And so whether you believe in climate change or anything at all, let me just tell you, anything that's going to impact the frequency of storms or frequency of rain and impact our temperature is going to have an impact on this disease and other diseases.
And yeah, I mean, I agree with Travis and Bob. And the other point I want to make is that my trial that was planted late this year was because we couldn't get into plant any earlier down in southeast Iowa because we had so much rain during the spring. And so one of the things about climate change or the change in the environment about the Midwest is that we're going to have these wetter, cooler springs, and then we're going to have this very dry period, you know, kind of during July and August with some rains coming in later. And so when I look at that trial down in southeast Iowa, we planted late because of a cool and very wet spring. Sure, it was dry through July and August, but then when we started to get that rain, the rust had already built up in the south, and the corn that I was in was at a you know, midway through grain fill, and it just got hammered with southern rust. So yeah, I mean, I can I could see that southern rust could become way more important up here in the Midwest.
Thank you, Allison. Moving on to the next question. This person says, what do you think are potential reasons that the same fungicide has variable effectiveness in different regions of the country? Would it be due at all to different races of rust having more success in various regions?
I'm not so sure about the different races because we don't really track that anymore. Maybe some of the others have an opinion. Bob mentioned too with the application, sometimes it's the coverage with some materials. I know with the airplane with 2 gallons, sometimes that amount of coverage is not sufficient. In most of our efficacy trials, I'm using like 15 gallons because I'm able to get that coverage, but I'll let some others kind of comment.
I think a large part of that, and I often pick on my buddy Tom Allen over Mississippi, and sometimes we don't have the same recommendations. We're looking at the same disease, we don't have the same recommendations, and a lot of it comes to what our experience is in our states with the trials we're doing. And I think if you look at the whoever asked this question, if you looked across the board at what we can recommend, we're all recommending the same things. But I would say the emphasis which is given to one fungicide, perhaps more by Georgia, say, versus Arkansas versus Iowa, may be at the timing of the trials that we put out, the conditions under which the intensity, we may have slightly different results in that sense. But I don't think any of us would disagree on what's efficacious. Our own personal experiences based upon our research may give us a nudge towards one versus another.
I mean, you guys know that I'm just obsessed with the disease triangle, right? And so that's the pathogen plus the host plus the environment. And so I have to wonder about the host, right? So at our different locations, we're growing corn, but we're growing different hybrids. And, and those genetics and those hybrids, I think, also plays a very big role in just how efficacious those fungicides can be. And so I think that genetics is in there as well. And maybe that's why we see differences. I know that here in Iowa, I can have Baltima do awesome at one location, and then at another location, it won't do as well. And, so in the environment differs, but so does the hybrid. So how much of the hybrid genetics is playing a role in that?
Thanks, Bob, Travis, for your comments as well. I think this is a pretty good question. Actually, it's 2 questions this person asked, so I'm just going to throw out both, and you folks can respond as you see fit. 1, how prevalent is southern rust in sweet corn fields? And 2, is plant population a major factor for the disease?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. So we can, southern sweet corn. Last year, my technician decided to plant a little within our trials, and it's the first thing that gets southern rust. Of course, it's maturing faster than our other commercial hybrids too. And then, of course, with the population, anything that's going to affect that environment, keep that free moisture around longer, it's certainly going to be more severe. And that's my experience, and I'll let others comment.
Yeah, the sweet corn is very susceptible. I was talking with a sweet corn grower this morning, as a matter of fact, and he said he sprays 5 fungicides a year on a sweet corn crop. Is with tar spot coming in, is that going to change? And so the take-home message for us in this audience today is sweet corn growers don't have to be told to spray. They're going to spray a fungicide because of the value of that crop. And so the reason it's not a bigger problem for our sweet corn growers is because they're not trying to decide, should I spray or should I spray once or twice? They're just going ahead and doing it with everything else they're doing. It's the management, the intensive management, that keeps rust in Georgia from being more of a problem on sweet corn rather than susceptibility.
I don't know a whole lot about sweet corn in Iowa, but I mean, I'm not sure that sweet corn has very good resistance to southern rust. So, that might play a role. But I mean, I would say that what I do know of sweet corn is, as they're saying, as Bob says, way more intensively managed, and so getting out there and spraying.
Very good. Well, thanks to each of you again for answering the question. We are pretty much out of time here, folks. So I just want to wrap up with the last few seconds I have to say thank you to each of our speakers. Thank you to the Crop Protection Network. And please, for each of these speakers, follow up with them if you're interested, because we do have many questions that went unanswered. And some of you folks asked some really, really good ones that I think would be worth getting an answer to. So with that, Allison, Travis, Bob, thank you so much for being with us today. It was wonderful, very informative. And folks, please join us for the future Crop Protection Network supported webinars coming to you through the American Society of Agronomy. We certainly hope you will join, as Travis said, and Allison, Bob. It's a big network out there, and there's going to be other topics and a lot of folks contributing from other institutions. So we look forward to hearing from all of them. With that, I did have a few questions today about getting your CEUs. I know we're at the end of the CEU cycle for some of you this year. You will get your CEUs. There's no QR code to scan. They're automatically logged, so have no fear. If you're listening to this live, you will be getting your CEUs soon. Thanks to each of you. Everyone, have a wonderful day. Take care, and bye-bye.